There are few figures in history as romanticized as the medieval knight. All of us grow up hearing stories of chivalry and valor, knights saving damsels and slaying dragons. They're the subject of countless famous stories and paintings, and they've come to be the single greatest symbol of the Middle Ages at large. But not all knights rescued damsels, and in fact, many knights and aspects of knighthood would very much look queer through today's lens, and may even have been queer back then. Medieval knights were a lot gayer than we realize, and even engaged in the medieval equivalent of gay marriage. But it's a little complicated, so let me take you on a journey through the world of swords and chivalry and the strange world of medieval romance. Come learn with me. Oh yeah, speaking of marriage, I'm engaged. Some of you might have noticed this bad boy in the last video, but yes, I'm getting married next year, so I've had historical gay marriage on the mind, and the first thing I thought of was the homoerotic chivalric bonds of medieval knights. This is a topic that I've wanted to explore for years, and what better excuse to finally hop on it. So let's get into it, but first, a word from today's very exciting sponsor, the Hushfall Archives. If you're watching this video, you probably love the Middle Ages in some way, and the new Unearthed collection from the Hushfall Archives was made for you. The Hushfall Archives is a trans-run group of artists creating inspired pieces with historically minded personalities, following a slow fashion model prioritizing environmental friendly practices and natural fiber fabrics. The Hushfall Archives makes pieces of wearable art, and this new collection has absolutely knocked it out of the park. I already had a couple of pieces from their first collection, Saints and Sonnets, which is where this shirt is from, which were already incredible and a constant staple in my wardrobe, but as soon as I opened these new pieces up, I was genuinely gobsmacked by how incredible the quality was and how beautiful they are in person. Even the socks are some of the highest quality I've ever had. They have like a padded heel on them. They're so comfortable. And look at the frogs! This collection is based on the quirky and beautiful illuminations from medieval manuscripts like the mysterious Voynich manuscript and, my favorites, the unicorn tapestries in the Met Cloisters collection, with references all lovingly and painstakingly researched to avoid falling victim to the scourge of AI. It's like they went inside my brain and manifested exactly the clothes that I wished existed. The tapestry vest is adjustable and so cute with the tassels, and matches this belt bag with enough room to fit the essentials, and this belt is perfect for holding it. The lightweight cotton bandana has such nice colors, great for covering my neck in this infernal heat. I can't wait to wear the corduroy shirt jacket come fall. It's a perfect layering piece, as well as this super cozy and beautiful cropped unicorn in captivity hoodie. And of course, this very silly and soft lightweight printed button down with sleeves that you can roll up and button in place so they don't come down, covered in silly little medieval critters that we know and love. Seriously, go get yourself some new pieces from the Hushfall Archives by heading to the link in the description below and unearth your medieval whimsy. Thank you so much to the Hushfall Archives for sponsoring this video, and now let's get back to learning about gay medieval knights. Everything evolves out of some prior thing, including modern marriage. Ancient Greco-Roman legal unions gave way to the unions of the Middle Ages, and they looked very similar. But one thing to note is that for over 1,000 years, people were simply not really usually getting married and expecting it to fulfill their needs romantically or sexually. It was largely a political, social, or financial agreement. Of course, in any close bond, there are inevitably romantic cases, and you see quite a lot of that in the Middle Ages, and many people grew to love each other. Still others purposely chose each other for romantic bonds, which is where queer unions come in, and in those cases it was often not very sexual in nature, if at all. But that doesn't mean it never was. This is because being gay as an identity was just not really a thing back then. Gay was a thing you did, not who you were, so people could be attracted to people of the same sex in a wide spectrum of ways, like today, without it informing their personhood necessarily. Sodomy itself didn't even mean back then what it means today, so unlike the modern era, many heterosexual sexual acts were just as condemned as gay ones. The framework was entirely different. It's as historian Alan Franson notes that queer theory demonstrates that, quote, same-sex relations are not incidental to the heterosexual world order. Like, You know how when a lot of people come out to their parents, the parents are like, "Oh, honey, everyone feels that way when they're young, you grow out of it." Like, no? Rather than actually saying anything about gayness being an anomaly, a blip on the radar of an inherently straight world, rather, people who may consider themselves straight or normal still experience and engage in the spectrum of same-sex desire and homoeroticism. It's the reason why straight men are more obsessed with looking muscular and beefy, because their gym bros approve of it, despite overwhelming feedback that women aren't actually largely attracted to that body type. Or straight girls in a sorority making out at a party and laughing it off because it's not serious. Whether these actions are couched in a heterosexual gaze or desire doesn't negate the fact that they're still homoerotically charged and the participants derive pleasure from it. Michel Foucault writes in The History of Sexuality, Volume 1, as defined by the ancient civil or canonical codes, sodomy was a category of forbidden acts. Their perpetrator was nothing more than the juridical judge of them. The 19th century homosexual became a personage, a past, a case history, and a childhood. It was consubstantial with him, less a habitual sin than as a singular nature. The sodomite had been a temporary aberration. The homosexual was now a species. Now, obviously, Foucault makes good points here. Before homosexuality and heterosexuality were defined by late Victorian sexologists, sexuality was a thing you did, an action, rather than who you were. As in, sexuality was not thought of as an inherent identity. And that includes heterosexuality. But at the same time, Foucault does fail to fully acknowledge the fact that in the past, people who were known to have homosexual proclivities were often defined in their communities by those traits. Regardless of whether being gay existed as an identity, acting on gayness did become part of one's identity in certain cases, and we can find a lot of evidence of this directly through the plethora of homophobic plotlines or angles taken in medieval literature. If they were condemning it, it goes without saying that it was happening. One of my personal favorite analyses of medieval queerness and the problems it poses comes from Richard Zeikowitz in his book Homoeroticism and Chivalry, Discourses of Male Same-Sex Desire in the 14th Century. It's one of the main sources for this video. He puts it like this: I am not concerned with delineating specific sexual identities, but rather bodies in motion, homoerotically charged moments, suggested or dramatized in 14th century chivalric texts. By using modern theories to understand medieval texts, I am not claiming that people living at the time would have used similar formulations. The fact, however, that psychological processes were not conceptualized or were conceptualized in different terms does not necessarily mean that they did not occur. I know we have a lot of academic jargon here. Essentially, he's saying that despite the fact that modern ideas of what sexuality is didn't exist back then, doesn't mean that people weren't doing gay stuff. By reframing queerness as instances of desire, or the potentially erotic, we can open up history to a wider range of visible possibilities, without instantly shutting them down by placing them in preconceived boxes or labels. John Boswell uses this framework to defend his using the word gay to describe historical same-sex eroticisms rather than homosexual. Gay being a wider term allows for the inclusion of queer acts, or acts that are considered queer today that don't necessarily include, like, bumping coochies, if you catch my drift. Romantic actions, while widely accepted in history as non-offensive, can still be erotically charged in their historical context, and I say this in almost every video, but remember, there's two types of queer history: the queer history that was queer in its own time, and queer history that mirrors our queer experiences of today, and both are valid, both are necessary. Just need to keep reminding you. But the point is, yes, sodomy in the Middle Ages was not just, like, gay butt stuff. It was, at varying levels and times, literally everything outside of heterosexual PIV intercourse and marriage for the intention of making a baby. So sodomy included sex work, hand stuff, mouth stuff, premarital stuff, random freaky stuff, etc., 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 etc. This means that any union between any gender was possible because the union itself wasn't really the sin, it was your behavior. And there were a great number of officiated same-sex unions, many of which had ceremonies almost identical to heterosexual marriages. They would join the right hands, place a veil over the spouses, kiss, and have a wedding feast. Often, they would read the same exact psalms, sometimes exchange rings, and sometimes give vows. These same-sex unions were often described as declarations of brotherhood, and in the case that the two men were not already married and/or had children, meant that they would then share property assets and inheritance as one. It's not really surprising that gay unions akin to marriage were not uncommon, given the popularity of a number of gay saints. Saint Sergius and Saint Bacchus were extremely popular in the medieval world. The two men were officers in the Roman army in the 4th century who secretly converted to Christianity and were punished by being dressed in women's clothes and paraded in public and then sent to trial. Bacchus was beaten to death and appeared in ghost form to Sergius, telling him to hold strong so that they can spend eternity together. Sergius was tortured to death the next day. October 7th is their feast day as a couple. There was also St. Peter and St. Paul, and of course the eternal queer interpretation of St. Sebastian. There was also St. Alred of Rivaux, often interpreted as gay through his writings, St. Francis of Assisi, who many believe was in love with another man, Saints Polyeucte and Nearchus, St. Augustine, and St. Simeon of Emesa and John, who joined in a union together and lived for 29 years as a couple. And that's like not even half of them. So as you can see, the early medieval world was largely apathetic to homosexuality itself, in particular for people who weren't clergy or monks. The European Christian obsession with homosexuality as the ultimate sin didn't come about until the 14th century, and no one is entirely sure exactly why, but there are some random theories. Various very severe laws began to crop up, punishing homosexual acts, and even an erotic interest in the same sex without acting on it began to be seen as particularly heinous in the public imagination. So, same-sex unions began to trickle out and become less and less common. But the existence of queer attraction obviously never went away. You can't legislate or discriminate gay people out of existence. But this, of course, left us with a very persistent problem: the burden of proving the validity of these historical same-sex relationships. But all the issues that people lob as historical queerness are just as applicable to historical straight relationships. As John Boswell writes in Same-Sex Unions in Premodern Europe, public acknowledgement of erotic components of relationships is certainly not a reliable indication of what they might mean privately to the individuals involved. During the first half of the 20th century, when most of the anthropological work was done on artificial brotherhoods, such severe prejudice attached to the subject of homosexuality in the cultures producing these studies that hardly any researchers would have dared to impute an erotic component to the phenomenon unless the evidence was absolutely irresistible. Evidence about emotional states is, however, almost never irresistible. Indeed, it is rarely unambiguous. Just because straight relationships are the societal norm doesn't mean the feelings within them are more valid and even more real than the gay ones, or that gay relationships in history must be more scrutinized and delegitimized because they are inherently abnormal. As Boswell points out, there are multiple periods in history, in multiple cultures, when queer eroticisms were the predominant mode of thought. So it's honestly dishonest and hypocritical to demand more proof of historical queerness being valid when the same proof can't equally be provided for historical straightness, especially in the Middle Ages. You can't prove that these people loved each other any more or less erotically than the gay people swearing brotherhood to each other were. In fact, given the homosocial environments encouraged in the Middle Ages, men had a lot more chances to naturally explore queer inclinations than you think, even in monkhood. And there is no better breeding ground for this than the world of knights. So it's really hard to make generalizations about knights because things changed so much from generation to generation and from order to order and country to country, every place had their own very strong opinions. But there were some overarching themes that were in common. Knights were sworn into various orders as brothers in arms, promising loyalty not only to their kingdom but to their fellow knights. This makes sense because orders of knights were judged as a whole, not by individuals. If some guy went and committed a heinous act, like murdering a civilian or pillaging or whatever, it reflects on all of his brothers. So encouraging intimate bonds with other knights was pretty vital, and also helped them to perform better in battle. Much like modern-day soldiers, having your battle buddy meant that you were more likely to survive because you looked out for each other and were more motivated to be strategic and wise, rather than impulsive. So the knights' orders encouraged each other to act as a family unit, which were very tightly bonded and intense. Chivalric treatises were very strict, very detailed, and give us a very good insight into the erotic intimacy of the various knightly rituals that can easily encourage homoerotic bonds. One of these treatises is the Book of Chivalry by Geoffrey de Charny, written in the 1350s during the 100 Years' War. It describes the many steps of initiating a man from squire to knight. First, the novice knights are ritually bathed, not by attendants, but by other knights. Charny writes, "Then the knights should come to the beds to dress those to be knighted. The stuff in which they dress them, the linen and all that goes with it, should be new. Then the knights should robe them in red tunics, signifying that they are pledged to shed their blood to defend and maintain the faith of our Lord and the rights of the Holy Church, and all the other just rights set out above, which it is the knight's duty to protect. Then the knights bring black hose and put them on those to be knighted. Then the knights bring them white belts, with which they gird them, signifying that they should surround their bodies with chastity and purity of the flesh." During the ordination ceremony, the knight who does the officiating kisses the new knight ceremonially. This will become a problem later for the Knights of Templar, specifically. Charny also continually emphasizes the love and affection that a lord will have for his knights, and them to him in return. The homosociality and emotional bonds between these men are the core defining factor in what makes them good knights. Not only does it protect each other, it protects their financial and social futures. And the popularity of chivalric codes and values was very much a widespread thing. It was idealized, romanticized, even to people who weren't knights. It's the reason chivalry and romance are some of the most popular themes in medieval prose. Chivalric texts often get down to the nitty-gritty, explaining the meaning of individual actions between friends and defining friendship types on a spiritual level, often using both heterosexual and homosexual-leaning examples to describe things like kissing, embracing, and other forms of affection. These texts were inspired by writings like great thinkers like Alred, Aristotle, and Cicero, who all described same-sex friendships as ideally some of the highest, most intimate, and spiritually fulfilling relationships that one may ever have. Some of this has carried down to present day, with the persistent idea that men and women cannot truly be friends, that they can never be equals, that the wife is a tool and an asset and not a fully conscious being to be viewed equally. Naturally, then, the role of intimate equal falls to male friends. As Alred wrote in his 12th century work, De Spiritali Amicita, "Unless, therefore, you transfer his same affection to the other, loving him gratuitously, you cannot savor what true friendship is. For then, truly, he whom you love will be another self, if you have transformed your love of self to him." And as he later quotes from Ambrose's De Officiis, "Your friend is the companion of your soul, to whose spirit you join and attach yours, and to associate yourself that you wish to become one instead of two." Like marriage. When you look to Latin medieval poetry, you start seeing some very stark queer texts floating in. In one of his poems, Hilary the Englishman wrote this, and for warning, this dude, let's just say the poem does not hold up kindly today. "To an English boy, handsome boy, flower's beauty, shining gem, I want you to know that your face's beauty for me was the torch of love. As soon as I saw you, desire struck me, but I despair, for my Dido restrains me. I dread her wrath. I will succeed, I believe, for I will give myself to you as fair game. I'll be the lute and you the robber. To such a robber I surrender. Even the ruler of the gods was once a ravisher of boys. If he were here now, he would sweep away so handsome a youth to his heavenly bed. Then at last in the celestial palace, ready for either duty, now in bed, now with the cup, 2 in 1, you would please Jove. But as you can glean, it was not only common, but almost expected for knights to form couple-like and marriage-like bonds with each other, often lasting until death, and sometimes taking precedence over marriages that they had to women. Some brotherly couples were even buried together, like Sir William Neville and Sir John Clanvaux, who died likely of the plague in 1391 near Constantinople, and share a coat of arms. They were born the same year too, and spent decades of their lives together, becoming royal bedchamber knights together in the court of King Richard II before going on crusade. As we'll discuss, King Richard II was a king notoriously accused of homosexuality and a degree of lenience on masculine ideals in his court. The Chronicle of Westminster Abbey wrote of their death, "It was also on the 17th October that in a village near Constantinople in Greece, the life of Sir John Clanvaux, a distinguished knight, came to its close, causing to his companion on the march, Sir William Neville, for whom his love was no less than for himself, such inconsolable sorrow that he never took food again, and 2 days afterward breathed his last, greatly mourned, in the same village." It's important to note here that their coat of arms are connected on their shields and impaled like a married couple's would have been, which is why when their tomb was unearthed in the early 1900s, people assumed they were a married couple. What's interesting to me is the two men came from very different backgrounds. John Clanvaux came from a more modest family background, whereas William Neville was from a more rich and respected family line, and he was actually married to some woman named Elizabeth, which makes it even more interesting that the two men were buried together in this manner, in this very overt tombstone. Clanvaux also wrote several things that are very well known, and both of them were very close friends of Geoffrey Chaucer. And one of Clanvaux's works, the Book of Cupid, God of Love, was a poem praising love while also being like a satirical sort of analysis of how love can be more troublesome than it's actually worth. So there's a lot of little clues there as to what might have been the nature of their relationship and how William Neville's marriage might have played into it. So between that plus the chivalric virtues encouraging brotherly bonds, it's not hard to guess that Clanvaux and Neville were a bonded couple. One of the most widely known cases of alleged gay knights comes from the Knights Templar, a widely misunderstood order. Today, they're often viewed as like a still rampant or long dead secret society that controlled nations or whatever, but in reality, they were literally just a religious order founded in 1120 of regular schmegular knights who also fought wars over in the Holy Land and acted as protectors for Christian pilgrims. Mostly, people didn't like them back in the day because they were like really powerful and therefore seen as super arrogant and rich. Ironically, given the obsession that modern homophobes have with them, the Order of the Knights Templar had a fairly complicated relationship with homosexuality. For decades, they were extremely prosperous and widely respected, having accrued an immense amount of wealth from their various conquests. They were destroyed as a group in the 14th century when they came under the scrutiny of King Philip IV of France, who was really annoyed by their power and their treasure hoard that was being stored in Paris. At this time, even being suspected of sodomy was enough to get a man tortured to death, so it was obviously the simplest way to take down such a powerful order. Philip enacted numerous sodomy trials against the knights, claiming that they denied Christ in their ceremonies, that they defaced the image of Christ, that they kissed in obscene ways, that they were idolaters, and of course, that they were sodomites. Some of these charges were inherently linked to accusations of witchcraft, and sodomy was almost always slapped onto most accusations of heresy at this time. This makes it really hard to say how many of the knights were actually guilty of sodomy, especially because they were tortured into confessions, and many of these confessing witnesses had wildly different answers as to what was actually happening. A wide number of the knights did say that while they were given permission to have intimate relationships with other brothers of the order, they didn't personally do so. It seems like the consensus was the higher-ups in the order were saying that it's actually okay to be homosexual in this order, but a lot of people didn't actually go through with it, or they said they didn't. Regardless, we'll never know for certain what the truth was, and the Knights Templar were destroyed forever. So you see, it was a narrow line to walk between what actions were acceptable or not, or what actions may have been acceptable and then later come back to harm you. It doesn't help that sodomy was such a vague term, and the legal documents from these trials pretty much never define specifically what they mean when they use it. So the actual accused crime is really vague. Not to mention, even in the times where homosexual acts were punished severely, it's hard to say how often the punishments were actually enacted. But because of how taboo this all was when people crossed the line, most of the evidence we have of gay knighthood actually happening in more explicit ways, as opposed to just the brotherly bonds, actually has to be read between the lines, often via homophobic literature. Literature in some cases places love between men in competition with heterosexual love or in the same plane of significance, and there is a long line of this being the case even pre-Middle Ages. Even in the Bible, the love between David and Jonathan is described in highly emotional terms akin to that of a couple, a relationship that would serve as an example for medieval brotherly bonds and oaths. And it came to pass, when he had made an end of speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit with the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And David and Jonathan made a covenant, for he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of the coat in which he was clothed, and gave it to David, and the rest of his garments, even to his sword, and to his bow, and to his girdle. And later, I grieve for thee, my brother Jonathan, exceedingly beautiful and amiable to me above the love of women. As the mother loveth her only son, so did I love thee. I do need to restate here again, queer history is not reliant on proof of whether people were having sexual relations with each other. Just because mentions of intercourse don't usually appear in these examples doesn't suddenly invalidate them as queer. Gay love is a spectrum of fulfillment and feelings and actions, just as straight love is. And in antiquity, the line between the two was not a line, it was a circular gradient. And more importantly, if you were to take any of these examples I'm using in this video and rocket them to the present day, guess what they would be called? So guess what they are in the context of queer history. And if you made one of them a woman, do I even need to keep going on? I feel like it's so obvious. People who are going to willingly misunderstand me are going to willingly misunderstand me and yell at me in the comments and improve my engagement, so thank you. Go yell at me some more. Obviously, there's a lot of argument among scholars this way or that way about this exact conundrum, but that is way too much to even begin to get into in this video. The fact is, queer history is still a very new mode of study and interpretation, and one that was suppressed for a very long time. So yeah, we're sort of stumbling through figuring out how we want to go about it. I mean, shit, queer history is hard, but that's partly because queer present is just as hard. Every damn day, people in this community are arguing about, frankly, very subjective or situational things as if it's objective or static, or has always been this way or that way. Queerness is not a fixed state because it is always informed by and in opposition to ever-shifting societal norms. But I don't think it's wrong to go to history looking for things that mirror modern frameworks, as long as we're not expecting them to be modern frameworks. Anyway, these themes, in large part, appear in knightly tales because the knight as a character is a keystone figure that various social anxieties and beliefs were projected on. Goran Stanivukovic writes in Knights in Arms, as a literary type whose sexual and erotic agency changes flexibly and freely in prose romances that were flourishing at the time when middle-class culture had just started to emerge in agrarian England of the late 16th century, the romantic knight of the 16th and early 17th century romances stands at the threshold of history of sexuality as a modern phenomenon. He occupies an important place in the still growing discussion of the historical emergence of sexuality itself. The knight also helps us understand how that sexuality started to be understood, and how sexual acts were imagined. A pretty pinnacle example of this appears, unsurprisingly, in the writings of Geoffrey Chaucer, the author of the Canterbury Tales. Chaucer's works need to be situated in the specific time he was living in. He was a diplomat in the court of King Richard II, remember that guy from earlier? One of the most famous allegedly queer kings of all time, and knew the guy personally, as well as a number of his alleged male lovers. The king was the hot topic of various gossip circles, whispering that he was being seduced by the Duke of Ireland, Robert de Vere. Richard had a very, very troubled reign, in part because he took the throne at just 10 years old in 1377, meaning his court was controlled by a regency council. Despite his attempts to show political control as he grew older, he was challenged repeatedly, and his various personal traits became the subject of heated gossip about his queerness. He was viewed as feminine with his blonde hair and lisp and gentle features. He also allegedly engaged in varying forms of sodomy, and had male lovers that the members of his court fretted were controlling him and his decisions, making him unfit to rule. He would eventually be deposed by his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, the Duke of Lancaster, who became King Henry IV, and the people in support of the new king, including Chaucer, used Richard's queerness as a framework to explore complicated feelings of male-male love in their works. After all, this was a continuous issue of the monarchy. Richard's great-grandfather, Edward II, also seemingly had a gay relationship with his courtly favorite, Piers Gaveston. And later down the line would come the very famously gay King James VI and I, who I have already made a video about. So naturally, these themes made their way not only into biographical and commentary works of the era, but fiction as well. Chaucer explores how homoromantic attraction can be placed in opposition to the heteroromantic attraction in The Knight's Tale, depicting a romantic relationship between, unfortunately, the cousins Palamon and Arcite, who are both in love with the same woman, Emily, but also declare unending love to each other, using very similar wording that wedding vows at the time had, reading, "That never for to thine in the pain, to that the death depart shall us twain, neither of us in love to hinder other, nay in none other case, my leve brother." Now, in the Middle Ages, this would not have been read as strange because of the intense culture of homosocial bonds between men, especially knights, and that's the whole point. Homosexuality and homoromanticism existed on a connected axis of erotically charged moments, always intertwined and always delicately situational. Oftentimes, the love or conquest of a maiden is, consciously or not, used as a vehicle for men to exercise their attraction to each other. Intricate rituals, etc. As Paul Strome writes in Social Chaucer, Chaucer's poetry not only presents a society in which vassalage has been replaced by an array of more casual relationships by sworn brotherhood, but includes a critique of those relations. When the two men see Emily outside their prison cell, they both fall in love with her, wounding their queer connection by the introduction of a normative target. The heterosexual object of affections threatens the homosocial brotherly bond by rendering it normative once more, as the two now have an acceptable romantic focus, straight marriage, that can forever place their relationship with each other in a safer realm. Friend of the channel Tyson Pugh writes, "Fraternal promises in Chaucer's literature evoke homosocial tensions and aggressions, and this dynamic hints that, for Chaucer, these particular bonds of brotherhood carried with them the likely possibility of queerness. By characterizing such homosocial relationships as intrinsically susceptible to betrayal and ridicule, Chaucer hints that male friendships, as incarnated through brotherhood oaths, were often viewed suspiciously in courtly and aristocratic contexts of 14th century England, despite the normative valence nonetheless accorded such relationships in these same social settings. Because of how common and anxious these plots were, it flays it wide open for every reader to see that these gay relationships were, in fact, happening." A number of these themes continue to appear in Chaucer's works, such as his poem Troilus and Cressade, in which a Trojan warrior named Troilus is punished by the god of love to fall in love with a young woman, Cressade. Cressade has no desire to marry him, and her cunning uncle begins scheming to get the two together. While the story is obviously mainly about the hetero-romance, its other theme is the homosensual relationship between Pandarus and Troilus, who share numerous erotically charged moments in the poem, such as when Troilus sends for Pandarus, who finds him in bed and teases him for how sexy and injured he looks after just fighting a battle. Later on that night, there is a very erotically tense scene as the two men lay near each other in a bed, and Chaucer uses the symbolism of flowers rising towards the sunlight to imply... Hard to say, but Troilus pledges his life to Pandarus. And even later, after Troilus and Crusade consummate their love, Troilus's first action is to call for Pandarus. Of course, later on in the story, the two drift apart and end on poor terms, but a huge amount of their character arcs is orbiting each other, the love story with Crusade being a vehicle to bring them together. No one knows if Chaucer actually intended to create a sort of love triangle here, but that's what's happening. It's kind of like when you're reading a book or watching a show, and the two male main characters have obvious female love interests, but the author hates women so much that the love interests are written poorly, or the hetero relationships are underdeveloped, so as a result the bromance between the two male main characters ends up being much more developed and wildly more compelling, so obviously people ship them. Yeah, this happens frequently in historical texts, but in few places as famous as Arthurian legends, many of which are fairly modern. The Once and Future King, some of the most famous Arthurian tales, were published in 1958, but several Knights of the Round Table have a long history of being portrayed with homoromantic interests, especially Galahaut, Gawain, and Lancelot, who, to be fair, has sometimes been described as being Guinevere-sexual, but that doesn't stop him from containing multitudes. Because Lancelot in the Prose Lancelot story is definitely in boyfriends with Sir Galahaut, and the two are even buried together. Galahaut, a half-giant prince, basically abandons his throne to be with Lancelot. He's obsessed with possessing Lancelot's affections. One night the two men are sleeping in the same room, and Galahaut sends his soldiers away so he may be alone with Lancelot, who sleeps peacefully while Galahaut lies awake thinking of him. Galahaut also swears to keep Lancelot and Guinevere's romance a secret, effectively entwining him in Lancelot's sexuality. Everything Galahaut does is in line with classic medieval romantic tropes that any overt couple would have. Galahaut repeatedly declares his love and devotion to Lancelot, swears that Lancelot is more dear to him than worldly honor, which is a crazy thing for a knight to say in these stories because honor is sacred. Meanwhile, Lancelot feels extremely torn because he yearns for Galahaut, but is also madly in love with Guinevere. There's a lot in the Galahaut-Lancelot scenes of the Prose Lancelot that the anonymous author leaves purposely to the imagination, namely to hold on to some sort of plausible deniability. Straight and/or homophobic readers could just see them as extremely devoted brothers in arms, while gay or forward-thinking readers in the know could look at it and see the possibilities beyond the fog. But other Arthurian tales were much more overt. I won't get too much into Sir Gawain and the Green Knight because I've made a whole video on that, but this tale is one of the most famous cases of queerness in a medieval knight story. This story, like many of the others, is a case of what Richard Zeikowitz calls triangulated desire, where a character's desire for the other man in his homosocial bond is funneled through a female character to indirectly act upon it. Sir Gawain is challenged by the Green Knight to strike any blow upon him, and then the Green Knight may return that blow 1 year hence. When Gawain cuts the knight's head off, the knight picks his head up and declares that Gawain must meet him a year later for the ending to their challenge. Gawain sets off on his journey at Christmas time and comes upon the castle of Lord Bertilac and his wife. Bertilac lets Gawain stay and feast with him and challenges Gawain to a suspiciously familiar game. Every day, Bertilac will go out hunting, and when he comes back, Gawain must give him whatever he has won during his time at the castle. At the end of each day, Bertilac rewards Gawain with the game he hunted, and because each day Lady Bertilac comes on to Gawain and kisses him, Gawain then kisses Bertilac in exactly the same way he was kissed by the lady. First once, then twice, then 3 times, always with great enthusiasm. In this setup, Lady Bertilac is the mediator rather than a proactive love interest. The real tension is between Bertilac and Gawain, which becomes even more loaded when it is revealed that Bertilac is actually the Green Knight. One of the most popular romance themes at the time is the quest for the Holy Grail, and the Grail romances provide an interesting departure from common knightly tales where instead of a knight's reward on his quest being a beautiful maiden, he is instead rewarded with a special connection to God. The Grail romance knights are chaste and seemingly devoid of desire, which in the context of medieval masculinity effectively queers them and feminizes them. Medieval knightly romances have a very straightforward framework framework. Men are great warriors, women desire them, and women's bodies are the reward for being a really cool knight. And it's strange for a knight to reject this framework by accepting chastity. Sir Galahad, Lancelot's son, is a primary example of this, being deemed the good knight for his faithful chasteness. Don't get him confused with Galahad, they're not the same dude. Other pretty striking examples are elsewhere, like The Belt by Dietrich von der Gletze, in which a knight's wife disguises herself as a male knight Mulan style to go test the character of her loser husband, and portrays herself as a homosexual man, telling her husband, who is unaware of her true identity, that she'll help him gain some glory if he sleeps with her. At first he's like, oh man, it sucks that this guy is gay, but then he decides that he needs to be in it to win it, and he agrees. And right before they actually go through with it, she reveals her true identity and basically calls him a gay pussy. While obviously a very homophobic setup, it's pretty revealing as to some much critiqued realities of knightly orders. Another example is in Frauenbach by Ulrich von Lichtenstein, in which a lady snaps back at a knight who is complaining about how bitches these days are all sluts, by pointing out that many men these days are falling victim to homosexuality, a most unspeakable crime. And then the guy is like, whoa, not all men. I totally agree, we gotta kill all gay people. And then they both change the subject because even thinking about gay people is so scary. It's really goofy, but still not all that different from the type of shit you hear today on Instagram Reels clips of those bad podcasts of straight men and women debating each other. These stories are varied and complex and reveal to us a great deal of things by accident, purely by being so dang homophobic or condemning gay practices. They let it slip just how prominent being gay actually was, even among knights, especially among knights. And the chivalric virtues knights were expected to abide by both made it scarier for them to be gay and created a more diverse space for men to meet other attractive men and give them frameworks to explore fulfilling, socially acceptable bonds with each other, some of which were even legal or on par with actual marriage. It wasn't exactly a homo-utopia, but it's certainly much different from the way we think of medieval knights today. So yes, medieval knights were much gayer than you think, and they slayed. Thank you for learning with me about gay medieval knights. I wanted to do this one for years, and I'm so glad I finally had the perfect reason to do it. Seriously, this Hushfall Archives collection is amazing. I'm absolutely astounded. Go get yourself some fun medieval garb, link below. And don't forget to grab a copy of my graphic novel, Liberated, The Radical Art and Life of Claude Cahun. And until next time, wash thy hands, wear thy mask, and buckle thy chastity belt.